Welcome back to the Free Code Camp podcast. I'm Quincy Larson, teacher and founder of freeCodeCamp.org. And today we are talking with Robby Russell. He's a software engineer who created the popular open source project Oh My ZSH. He also runs his own software development agency where he's been helping companies like Nike build projects for decades at this point. Before we get to him, Free Code Camp just launched the newest version of Harvard CS50. This is a full university course taught by Dr. David Malin, whom I've previously interviewed here on the podcast. Learn to code in Python, and this version of the course will also teach you fundamentals like functions, conditionals, loops, libraries, file IO, and more. You're going to learn about databases. You're going to even learn some C, a whole bunch of computer science concepts. If you're looking to go deeper with your skills and especially your conceptual knowledge, this is an excellent place to start. It's a 25-hour course right here on the Free Code Camp YouTube channel. Check it out after you finish listening to the podcast. Free Code Camp also published a great article that will help you figure out where to go from a place like, oh, I've completed Harvard CS50. What do I do next? Well, this tutorial will help you bridge from beginner projects like the ones you see on Free Code Camp to building real-world applications that solve real-world problems. It's an excellent read. I strongly encourage you. It takes about 40 minutes to read. And you may have heard of OpenClaw, or you may have heard of OpenClaw, or I think it was like ClaudeBot or Moltbook. There are like lots of different names this has gone through over the past few days. And essentially, it is a powerful agent tool and it's dangerous. You don't want to just run it on your system. You want to contain it because it's so powerful. But essentially, you want to have your own messaging gateway that lets you communicate with the outside world, that lets you automate digital tasks through platforms like Discord. And this tutorial will show you how to set it up. Then you'll learn security practices like implementing Docker-based sandboxing to protect your host system while your agent executes complicated workflows on your behalf. This is a 1-hour course on the Free Code Camp YouTube channel. We also published this overview of some big improvements to the Bluetooth protocols, new features, 3 major upgrades, passive scanning, bond loss reasons. Essentially, you can figure out what happened, and propagation of service UUIDs. If you're interested in networking engineering or Internet of Things, IoT style devices, this is well worth the read. Our song of the week, I absolutely love this song, 2009 banger from Australian band Miami Horror, Sometimes. I love the layers of guitar, and there's this awesome like Peter Hook kind of like New Order slash what was the band he did before? Joy Division, kind of like just really cool jangly guitar riffs and this just anthemic synth sound and a really driving bass line. This is a perfect song to start your morning off. I've got a link to it in the description. And I want to encourage you to join the 10,221 very chill human beings who donate to our charity each month. Free Code Camp's a charity, and you can support our mission at donate.freecodecamp.org. You can make this podcast possible. You can make so many of the other things that Free Code Camp does possible through your support. You can also get this awesome Free Code Camp shirt that I'm wearing and rep the community with pride. $20 with free shipping anywhere in the US. If you're outside the US, just grab our assets from the assets library free for non-commercial use if you just want to bring your own Free Code Camp shirts. And now let's talk to Robby Russell. As I said earlier, he created the open source project Oh My ZSH, spelled ZSH, and it is a framework for managing your ZSH configuration of your command line terminal. I use it. Everybody on the Free Code Camp team, I think, uses it. It's extremely useful, and it's been extremely useful for more than a decade. Robbie is also the CEO of Planet Argon, a software development consultancy that he created 2 decades ago, and he's done work for so many different companies, especially a lot of companies out in the Pacific Northwest like Nike. And we're going to talk about how a don't let it happen again culture can make it take forever to get new code pushed into production. Robbie runs a podcast called Maintainable, and he is constantly focused on maintainability. So he has really nuanced thoughts on this. He also has tips for reducing your team's dependency on one developer who's just been there for years and knows where everything is. All that tacit knowledge is going to walk out the door with that developer. How can you reduce your dependency? And he also has a lot of nuanced perspectives on LLM tools and how they're speeding up his workflows. As always, we are a hype-free podcast. We are just going to bring you interesting insights that you can apply, and Robbie brings those in spades. Robby Russell, welcome back to the Free Code Camp podcast. Thrilled to have you back, man.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me back, Quincy.
Yeah, and I want to just start with a quote that you said that I thought was kind of profound. Most of our careers as developers are spent living inside someone else's decisions. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a couple parts to it. Most software developers are more likely to be working on code that already exists. Like you show up every day and you start working and you open up your code editor, whatever you're using, Vim, VS Code, what have you. There's a bunch of code there, unless you're starting a brand new project today and you're one of the lucky people getting to do that. But most people get hired to work at a company that has already written software, and now they have the budget because they have some sort of product or features that warrants bringing in and hiring people. So you're going to inherit all of the decisions and time and energy and nuances that your predecessors or I think the important part is your former self, the decisions that you might have made 6 months ago. And I don't know how often our body replenishes itself with all the cell regeneration, but we're not the same person as we were a couple of years ago. And so day in and day out, we're having to kind of work within the constraints of all of the decisions that anyone that had worked on this piece of software before, unless you're happy to get to work on a brand new thing. And even then, you're still working within the frameworks or the programming languages that you're deciding to use for that particular project, and having to work within those constraints. And so there's boundaries you have to think about. And so that's what I mean by that. So you're constantly living in that, and you're like, okay, how do I live with that? How do I evolve this? How do we tweak it and mold this a little bit based off of new information that I have today or that we have today as a team? And so that's how I think about that. And a big theme in my career has been realizing that and my company spends a lot of time inheriting a lot of decisions, whether they're technical decisions, user interface decisions, project management decisions, business decisions, like, oh, we're not going to do this part of the thing. We're going to have to trim budget over here to ship this feature because of time or budgets, money, what have you. And we have to live with those constraints. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just the realities. And I think that applies to just about anything we do in your house, your home. You could always keep refining and improving things. You're like, I would have done it differently. To me, feels like a cop out. And it's not like, well, what can we do with where things are today? Like, I know I need to improve the gate between my front and backyard on the side of the house. A screw came loose. It's been 6 months. I'm like, do I have to replace the whole gate, or can I just replace that piece of wood? I haven't spent enough time Googling this or asking ChatGPT for advice on it, but that is a thing I need to figure out. Like, that someone made a decision to build it and do it that certain way. I want to improve it, fix it. How do I deal with those sorts of constraints? And that's our day in and day out of working in software.
Yeah, and as a professional software developer who's been doing this for more than 2 decades now, and somebody who works with tons of developers, like, what proportion of time do you think most developers spend maintaining existing code as opposed to going off and getting some exciting new greenfield project where, like, okay, the boss gave me the green light, I can like kind of figure out how I want to architect this and what kind of contemporary tools I want to bring into this? You know, like, what would be the ratio that most developers would be looking at during their typical career?
I would be shocked if it wasn't 99 point several nines of percentage. I mean,
is maintenance.
Yeah, it's taking. Well, I think maybe if you didn't work on something building, I think, and then we can get into like the nuances of like, are you building a new feature that doesn't exist yet with the new set of requirements, and you're kind of still having to work within the existing constraints of your software. I think in that perspective, I think it depends on where you are within a company. So I can tell you that maintenance, whether I think maybe separating the maintenance task, which is like just grooming, taking care of the garden, pulling the weeds out, dealing with technical debt, like that is, I think some companies try to like they'll earmark, well, we're going to spend like 20% of our time doing that and 80% working on new things. But usually even when you're working on new things, you're usually like, I'm adding a new button to this page or a couple new, we need this drop down to show up if these things selected. So you're not building a whole new thing. You're appending things or removing removing some things. And so you're just making it a little bit more, adding more complexity as we know more as we go. So I think it's a hard question to answer probably from that perspective, because like I don't know where you decide what's maintenance versus just new greenfield things, but just I think, and then people will rotate. Some organizations will rotate maintenance teams or whatever. You're on support for the next 2 weeks, and then the rest of the team is working on new features and stuff like that. But you might just be dealing with bugs, and those are important things to be dealing with as well. So I don't know. It's always going to be a little different in every organization, I think, is the bottom line there.
Yeah, and maybe a definition would be like creating a new repo, because you've written a little bit about this. Like a lot of companies will have like 50 repos, and those are not necessarily distributed across, 10 engineers that each own like 5 repos or something like that.
No.
What are the actual dynamics of like maintaining a whole bunch of disparate projects, many of which were at one point greenfield, but have since over the many years probably become legacy projects that have to be supported and maintained?
Or they've been forgotten too. Because that happens quite a bit. Like, especially in larger organizations, there's always let's spin up a new repository, work on a new project. But the ownership of those projects doesn't like necessarily change. I mean, it will change in the fact that nobody owns it. I think is pretty common thing that ends up happening. But I have like a take on like when companies and teams are deciding when they're going to start doing things. Like when do you decide to spin up a new repository within your private organization, and like say GitHub or something? And I think having version control for things is great. I think people get excited about working on a brand new little thing. It solves a small problem, and I think that's great. I don't think we're always really good at archiving those things when they're no longer being used or when that person leaves. And so someone will look at the list of repositories and they're, we will have companies come to us and they'll be like, there's 80 repositories, but nobody's touched 60 of them in over 5 years. So are those still being used? Are they deployed somewhere? There's a lot of things to try to figure out. Is it just being cloned from is it a Git submodule that's being pulled in or something? Is it just like a fork of a gem that someone needed to get through? Like a gem being like, that's a Ruby gem, so I'm using that. But like say you have a node package or something and like you need to do something and you found a bug that's in your, so some companies will just fork that project, make a tweak to their, to that third-party library so that they have their version while they're waiting for the official project to accept maybe a pull request that may or may never happen, but at least they got it to work for them. And so those might be repositories that you're now responsible for tending to, and those might show up in your, your package.json or your Ruby gem files, and things like that. So, I don't know if I got to your original question there.
But basically, like, there are a lot of repositories that are essentially, like, just unknown. And I've often heard, like, if you wrote code more than 6 months ago and you haven't gone back to look at it, it's almost kind of like you're having to go in with fresh new eyes and try to relearn why it was built the way it was. And maybe you've got some vague remembrances, but it's hard. And companies accumulate these repos. They accumulate service that does a specific thing. They accumulate these forks of projects that you were waiting for, like some major release or something like that, or you had to customize something and you're waiting to catch up. And you accumulate, like, and a lot of this is just called technical debt, more vaguely, is like a whole bunch of relatively unmaintained projects. And of course, there's attrition within the staff. People leave the company, and they were the only one with the tacit knowledge that knows how this worked. And now a whole bunch of people have to go on an expedition into the code to try to figure out forensically why it is architected the way it is, right? So you get a lot of situations like that, and your agency, as I understand it, your software development consultancy, it focuses on helping companies go in and essentially revitalize dormant repos or figure out what needs to be shut down and what needs to be rewritten. Of course, you've said, and I'll say this in quotes, rewrites aren't always progress. Sometimes they're just an expensive way to forget what you've already learned. Can you elaborate on that, and the desire to do rewrites?
there's this tendency to, as humans, think like, not knowing what I know now, I think we could do this simpler or faster now than dealing with the problem. I mentioned like the gate on the side of my house earlier, like, oh, maybe a new gate would just actually be easier. But like within software, I think we think of it as this malleable thing where it's like, well, it's cheap enough, and we can get into the details of like how AI may or may not change this perspective. But the we really underestimate just how much complexity and time and energy went into building a piece of software that is running, let's say, in production for an organization. And so, and you can talk about like the old repositories and like that maybe a separate type of class of that. But one of the things that we find is that companies will get to a point where there's this kind of, I wrote about this last year, and it's like a tech adoption kind of like timeline that like there's early adopters that are super excited about a piece of technology. Let's just use frameworks for examples, or a programming language. And like, so they're super excited. And for whatever reason, the company decides they're going to build this project. And maybe it was a rewrite 15 years ago from some previous thing. That is also very likely a situation. But let's say it's a brand new thing and someone's like, okay, what's the new hot technology to use today? And find a bunch of people that are super excited about technology. They start building the thing. Those early adopters, they're around, and then it finds a product market fit. You've got customers, or you find some use cases in your organization. If it's an internal application that maybe you're just organizationally used within there, those projects are some of our favorites, to be honest. There's like internal operations tools. But when those projects, you work on those projects for a while, and then at some point it starts being like, oh, we need additional people to maybe help support this. And so you start hiring and recruiting people to come into the organization to work on it. And then great. Well, those people that are like this, the second or third wave of people coming into the project, they're not maybe necessarily always the same type of people as the early adopters. At some point, some of those early adopter people get excited about the new technologies that also exist, and they're like, well, we're not going to rewrite this. And they go move on, and they help an organization spin up some brand new thing with a new piece of technology. Meanwhile, those other people that were hired are there maintaining and working on the project, and they like it. Now, you fast forward that 5 years, 7, 10 years, you keep bringing those people in that have come into the industry because they're excited about the career and maybe the financial benefits of working in the software industry, and this technology that they're interested in, great. They don't love it in the same they don't have the same brain chemistry as an early adopter type person who's like tinkering on new ideas and playing on the cutting edge. They're just like, oh, I like working with technology. And then you bring in people companies will end up hiring people that are just really good programmers, and they can work with any programming language, and they can apply that skill set. And so at some point you get this point where you got a bunch of people being like, back to the earlier point of like, you're living with other people's decisions. They're like, well, there's all these other new technologies around, and it feels like we've got this kind of tangled ball of mess and some technical debt, and there's complexity, and we have all these weird workarounds. Wouldn't it be easier if we could just use this new thing that people seem to be more excited about? Because also it would look really good on my resume if I could add that I get to work with these other technologies. Not that I'm looking for a new job, but just for professional development. I feel like I'm maybe working on old technology now. And so that ends up being a problem that organizations have. And what that does is it plants these seeds that people will stop worrying about and investing a lot of time into advocating for improving your existing situation, because there's kind of this tension of maybe, just maybe, we'll get to redo this one day. So why? Right. And not that they're doing it intentionally, but there's this like, well, why care about taking care of things if we're just going to build a new thing in like a year or two once we get the budget approved? And so our business has been coming into these situations and being like, wait a minute, is that good for the business? Whether or not, let's get rid of the professional development aspect of like, that is an important thing for companies to think about, yes. But at the same time, company paid for a piece of software to be developed, and you want it to last and survive as long as possible, because that's the best. We're supposed to be good stewards of the software and the investments that they've made in the past and the investments that they're going to make in the future. That is our job as software developers, to keep software working and continue being able to make changes to it, make it so. Our industry has been our business model has been focused on like helping teams modernize their existing tech stacks as unglamorous as it may be, to give them like a second win, to give them a second act so that they can continue investing in those projects, because the allure of a software rewrite is always there for every single project. And I think once companies say, we are not going to rewrite this project, that's not going to happen. And so one of the things we'll come in and talk with companies and things that when I've coached people through this is like, hey, you got this small team of people, like, let me just give you this. I'm going to prompt you with this one thing to think about. Let's just assume that this is the last freaking software project that you will ever get to work on for the rest of your career. What would you do today to start improving your life as a software developer on this project? You could leave, yes, but let's just use that boundary. What can you start doing? And immediately people will start thinking of like, oh, well, all right, I guess if that was the situation, okay, how can we fix this? Let's start picking things we should start making improve. And then you start building some momentum and on improving your quality of life as a developer within the software project, that you can start seeing and build some renewed interest. But sometimes you also need to bring people that are outsiders to come in and help you, remind you of, like, people that are excited about that technology. Like, no. This software technology works today, and people are still building with this thing. This has got a long shelf life. And people will argue like, well, say that about COBOL. Fine. But like, I think for web software technology, like, not a lot has changed in the last 15 years. I think fundamentally, we've made a lot of complexity. We can get into, I don't want to get into a big language or framework for necessary. But anyway, that's what I mean by that.
Okay, that's super helpful. And I'm going to kind of unpack some of the things you said. First of all, the specter of a potential rewrite kind of clouds people's judgment, and it distracts them from the here and the now. Like, okay, what are we going to do with this software right now? What are we going to do with our garden to make it like reasonable to live here right now, as opposed to magically saying, oh, I'm going to move to a different house in a year or two, so why do I need to bother maintaining this one? So it sounds like that colors a lot of people's perception of like the joy of actually maintaining software, because they're just like, what's the point? I'm like kind of like fixing the clock on the Titanic as it goes down. Like, who cares that this clock is accurate? That's one of my favorite scenes from Titanic when I watched it as a kid. Not that I'm like a huge fan, but like that was the one scene. Literally, this is the only scene that has stuck with me all these years. Is the guy like checking his pocket watch and like updating the clock, even though the ship is going down. Nobody cares. He's probably the last person who's ever going to look at this clock, unless it's like some scuba diver or something. And it does sound like the allure of these new tools, and you put your finger on something very important, which is career development. The incentives of an organization are, to some extent, opposed to the incentives of an engineer who's working there, who may not be working there in a few years, and who may need a resume item that, like, hey, I worked with Golang, or something like that, right? And you talked about COBOL. COBOL has basically been the backbone of like a lot of important government systems, a lot of important corporate systems for decades. And, those systems have not been fully rewritten, and maybe they will be fully rewritten, but they've been doing, they've been workhorses. They've been getting things done, and they didn't require, like, we could have modernized to a contemporary tool many decades ago, but we stayed with those big mainframe systems. And what I'm hearing from you is you need to respect the judgment of the engineers who came before you, and not just assume they were, dumb, essentially, and that you're smarter than them. Because a lot of times when somebody sets out to rewrite a system, they're like, oh, look at all this cruft, I can rip out all this. And then they start ripping stuff out, and they start to realize, oh, actually, there's a reason that was there, right?
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
Like, never change something until you understand why it is the way it is kind of like my general life advice there. And it sounds like that does permeate a lot of the software development, maintain or rewrite conversation.
Very much so.
Yeah. So rewrites aren't always progress. Sometimes they're just an expensive way to forget what you've already learned. That is a quote from you.
Yeah. What I mean by that is when we think about, we'll get called in to, because like companies will be like, okay, we think it's time to rewrite this project because our development team has just gotten really slow. And so there's this like, kind of like trajectory where it was like they've decided that they're going to rewrite for whatever reason. And so we'll get called in to actually just be like, can you help us keep the lights on while we work on this rewrite? We're going to start working on new technology, and you can be responsible for taking care of our Ruby on Rails application and eventually help us sunset. And we've sunsetted several applications, and we can help navigate that process and help them migrate data and everything over to a new platform for the projects that are successful with those rewrites. But going back to that point around the allure of the rewrite, and I think another aspect of like right now in this particular, like it happens to be, we're recording this at the end of January 2026, and there's a lot of curiosity right now around rewriting software using AI to assist with that process. And so, this is even clouding our whole perspective on like where we're at as an industry. It's like, and I think those are viable conversations for teams to be having. And so I don't think this is quite answering your question, but something I've been recently thinking a lot about, because it's based off of some other conversations we've had with other potential clients, things like that we're talking to, is that I know that there's companies that are speaking with AI, with people that have 6 to 9 months more experience like doing AI assisted coding than their team does. And they're talking to companies, other consultancies, software agencies, specialists. They'll be like, hey, we can rewrite a big portion of your existing software project in months now. And whether or not that's true or not, but companies, CTO level people are being like, this is interesting. Maybe it's worth experimenting, because if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. At the end of the day, we'll spend a bunch of money experimenting with it. So they're doing R&D. But here's the thing that they're doing is that they're now outsourcing that R&D to another team that doesn't know all the complexities of your existing software.
They don't have all the tacit domain knowledge of the actual underlying business.
No, they don't. And so they'll come in and like try to understand that and like show them what's possible. And so I'm not trying to say there is a bit of snake oil salesman happening in the industry right now. Like we're seeing that. And so one of the things I've been advocating for teams to think about is like, hey, you need to get ahead of this. You should have an honest conversation as a development team. And, it sounds contrary to what I said earlier about not wanting rewrites, but I think as a team, you should at least be the person on your team, or be the team that says, hey, what if we were to write this? What might that look like if we were to use AI to help us with some of that? And how would we go about it? What would be the pros and the cons? And let's come up with a couple different, don't just pick one path like you're going to do. Like come up with 2 or 3 different strategies that you could explore, weigh those up, present that to leadership so that stuff, these ideas are coming from inside. The call is coming from inside the house rather than someone else from externally coming, because companies are going to start calling us to say, hey, can you come in and help us rebuild this thing? Because our development team seems way slower than they used to, so I think that's something that people need to be thinking about as well. So
way slower than they used to be because they're miring themselves in mediocre AI generated code.
No, because
or distracting themselves with these tools, or like why are people slower?
Teams are back to that point earlier where they've just decided to live in the world of living with the consequences and just blaming the predecessors and the past decisions and not making momentum on improving the state of their life as developers on their current project. So if they're not taking care of dealing with a lot of the technical debt, improving how fast their test suite works, making sure that they've reduced the amount of flaky tests, that their deployments are really quick, that we've had a lot of, we've spent a lot of time in the last 5 to 8 years adding a lot more infrastructure and observability. But I think a lot of teams are actually not even really taking advantage of that stuff as much as they do. And so now everything takes a lot longer to get from request to actually getting something shipped out. So I think about like, what's the time? If someone said to you like, hey, I need to change some copy on this particular interface in our web application, how many hours or weeks or months or minutes will it take for that request to get done? Like, oop, we found a typo. How long does that take?
To be in production.
To get to production, how long does that pipeline for like the happy path where it's literally just fixing a typo in some legalese or something?
Yeah,
How
like
long
a
does that
control
take?
F basically
Yeah.
in the code base. And
How
then
long
you
does-
find that and you update that. And then how long is the QA process? How long is the build process, deployment, all that stuff?
How many humans had to be involved in approving and reviewing that? I think we've optimized our workflow in a lot of ways to protect ourselves from, don't let that happen again. And so like, it's like what is it? Hell is like paved in the path of like best intentions, right? We have all these great intentions, like, oh, we're going to add all these checkpoints to protect ourselves. But then you end up with like it taking maybe a week to get a typo fix, and then and so that ends up creating a perception to people like your legal team or some other department, like our software development team seems really slow because all I asked for was a typo fix and it took a week to get to production.
Yeah, so what you're kind of alluding to, you said the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Like they're just trying to prevent things from catastrophically failing.
Yeah.
But in the process of doing that, they become so mired in procedure and process that it does take a long time to get things done. And so it's kind of backfiring. Like the less technical people on the legal team or the managers are looking at the team and they're saying, okay, they're forgetting that they haven't had a major blow up in a few months or something like that, like no downtime. And they're thinking, wow, why is everything slow? Well, it's slow because you don't want us to have any sort of major blow ups. And you can't really have your cake and eat it too, to an extent. Like in theory, like you could architect a perfect thing, but like that's not how the world really works. Things are constantly in motion. New design requirements are coming out. Code is moving around. Libraries are getting deprecated. There's just like you're maintaining this pretty sophisticated organism that is a code base, and not just the code base, but all the other infrastructure around that. And it sounds like that is what you're talking about when you say that like management may be like, hey, there's this allure of just handing everything over to the AI because it won't be slow. And they're completely forgetting that their team has built this extremely robust, dependable process that doesn't result in catastrophic outages. No,
it's well, I do think even if it's regardless of AI or not, there is an aspect of, if we're being honest with ourselves, we've slowed ourselves down too. And so there needs to be a little bit of tension in the other way. Like there needs to be a little bit of like, we need to remove some cruft in our process. Some of these checkpoints, these meant well. But it was also, we put these in at a certain time. Maybe all these checkpoints that we have are not as valuable now as they were 5 years ago. And maybe we need to cull that back. It's just like, it's like too much bureaucracy in a workflow. And maybe don't want to call it bureaucracy, but like all these little things that we end up doing to like, oh, we have to have multiple people review these things. We need to have a PR thing. And it's like, this was a typo, different. Like, how do you categorize? And maybe teams can get organized and be pretty smart. Like, oh, but like if it still takes like an hour or two to get a code change out like that, like it's a slow feedback loop. And so like deployments are slower than they used to be. We're spending a lot of time waiting on everything to run. Like, do we ever having the CIs run on GitHub versus we used to run those on our computers, and our computers are actually a lot faster than GitHub servers, and like we could probably run the test suite locally and like trust each other to do that. So there's a lot of like, there's some tension there that I think we need to kind of come to terms with as an industry. And I think maybe I'm just coming from I work in a smaller organization, but we work with pretty sizable companies, but I know that our clients want to move a lot faster than they are today, but they're not always willing to make some of those concessions. Be like, let's pull back on some of the guardrails. Maybe we have too many guardrails, so we can just like trust the team to ship things. Things might break a little bit, but maybe that will allow us to be a bit more cutting edge. But if you're just trying to keep stability so nobody has to deal with the 2 a.m. wake up call, fair, but that's going to come at a cost for your organization, and your developers are going to be waiting. Like it takes longer as a software developer. If you get assigned a ticket to work on it, and then it's going to take days or a week for that to get shipped to production, and then you got to remember like, oh, that's now out in production. If something pops up in a bug or something, and it's like, oh, that was like a week or two ago that I worked on, like the context, like you don't get to get that quick feedback from like real users. Whereas back in the olden days when we were just Wild West, we were just pushing to FTP, and it was just like, does it work? Does it work? Great.
Ultimate
great.
YOLO, pushing to FTP.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe that's not the ideal solution either, but there's got to be somewhere in between. And I think that tension, and I think AI assisted tooling right now is kind of giving developers that quick feedback again, and they're like, oh, look what happened, I can change this really quickly, and like, and they're getting that buzz. But they're also doing it on like a lot of personal projects, hobby projects, very low risk in that sense. But those building blocks build you up to you need to be able to deal with the consequences of projects. Because I think another thing is when companies hire people into an organization, and they have all these like existing guardrails to protect the organization, yes, but those developers don't get the benefit of understanding why those guardrails are important in the first place.
Right. Because like, it's just like every society has to figure out why, like certain things are important, like why you have to have like a state regulated like water utility, as opposed to just letting anybody create a water company.
Yes,
right?
exactly. That's true.
Yeah, so a lot of times like they're kind of speed running like civilization over and over again, because they're doing it on this small project, and they're starting to gradually realize the importance of different things. And that goes back to what we were talking about with maintainability. Everybody thinks they're smarter than everybody else, and that they and they think there's a lot of cruft that like, oh, why is this even here? Who cares? And so a lot of what you're saying is by going back, like there's this new tool, and you can just go spin up like an entire new service that maybe you're the only person using it. You can just tell the LLM tool to like give it a prompt requirements document, and it'll go and start, your agents will go and start making the pull request for you. And it seems all magical. And it's like, wow, look how fast I'm moving. Why is the old way so much? But it has very little to do with the tools. It has to do with like the human processes that have slowed things down.
Right. And like good software still requires clear ownership, a shared understanding, decisions that survive, let's say, the moment right now. Like, but we need to document these things. We need to make these decisions be understood in the future to, if anyone, for our future selves personally. One of the best reasons for like advocates, reasons why we should like write automated tests to some degree is for ourselves. So we can get it out of our head. We can document our requirements. And another thing is like code that someone can change without feeling really afraid of making changes to it. Like fear is something to be reckoned with, and I think and good software like requires us to kind of acknowledge that, and just like how do we reduce fear. And so we can talk about like, yeah, maybe all those guardrails reduce fear, but also sometimes we need to expose ourselves to bad things happening, because that's how we learn to do things and come up with better solutions on how to manage these things. Maybe some of the decisions on some of those guardrails that we had made 5 years ago were the best ideas we had at the time. There might be new ways of dealing with those types of guardrails now. Maybe we don't need to have this really laborious human workflow, because now there's some instrumentation or observability or some AI assisted tooling that could help us reheal things a little bit quicker now. Or, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if a deploy took always like less than 3 minutes, versus 30 minutes now? Like, I feel like those are things we could still be figuring out, like how could we kind of brute force things quickly to deal with that typo example. I think is like, I'm always like that I always lean to that, because I feel like it always usually ends up highlighting so many challenges along the way. And I'm like, do you really need to even have to think about every one of those steps every single time? And it just adds barrier that ends up making it less likely that you're going to feel super motivated and excited to spend some of that extra time to deal with a lot of maintenance type tasks, like to improve the code base, improve your test suite. Like, well, it's always going to take a long time anyway. So what am I excited to do today? So,
yeah, I mean, I could definitely see like people are going to be more excited jumping out of bed, getting their coffee or their tea, and thinking, I'm going to start working on this new project. I'm going to break ground on it, versus, okay, day N of maintaining this code base written by a bunch of people 15 years ago that has like special notes in it that say, don't touch this. I don't know how it works, but don't change it. It's too important. Lots of notes like that are littered throughout code bases. I'm sure you see a lot of this sort of stuff in your line of work, like basically maintaining other people's code. And I want to talk a little bit about running an agency right now. You're an agency that specializes not in greenfield development, but taking existing projects and getting more life out of them. And that's important work, because as we've said, like a lot of these systems may have decades worth of utility left in them if you look at the fundamental underlying business decisions around it, and not necessarily just like whether it's, you're chasing some sexy new tool that like slightly improves the developer experience, which is important because developers want to have fun and they want to feel confident in making changes. You've highlighted that as well. But let's talk about what it's like running a developer agency right now that is focused on maintaining projects, because you service a lot of the Portland area companies and stuff like that. But I've talked with people who run agencies in Bangladesh recently on the freeCodeCamp podcast and things like that. And what has it been like, and how is it changing with these new tools?
Yeah. Well, first a clarification. Yeah, we're headquarters in Portland, but our clients are distributed from Europe and across the across the US primarily. And we just have we have at least one notable client in the Portland area for sure. But anyhow, what's different now with the tooling is that there's a lot of, there's two types of clients that we have. We have some clients that they have their own engineering team, and we come in and help them either through they'll take one of our developers for a period of time, and it's like staff augmentation, team augmentation, where we'll embed a developer for a while, or we come in and help a team improve some existing workflows, or we'll come in for a contract for a couple months and help them improve some areas of their code base. And then we have other projects where they do not require 2, 3 plus full-time engineers working on those projects, because maybe it's an internal application and the organization, like the application is not the business. It's a component of like how they run some internal operations. And so we'll take on those projects from companies so that they don't have, because they'll have like a situation, maybe there was like 1 or 2 people that worked on it, or maybe a freelancer for a long time, and then, or maybe they had a couple employees and went down to 1 employee that was kind of in the corner working by themselves for a long time, and then they're going to leave to go work at a company with more developers to work, So we'll take on those projects, and we become the development team for those companies. So we're kind of like embedded into that organization. So those are 2 types of camps of projects we work on. So we have projects that we're completely responsible for every change to the code base and the infrastructure. We manage all that for them. And we have other companies that we're coming in and we're guests for a period of time, and using our wide variety of skill sets and exposure to lots of different types of companies to come in and give them a little bit of a new perspective. So
okay, and just to understand real quick, so I'm going to recap. You've got the embedded devs, and then you've got hey, we're going to just take over all your software engineering needs because whatever you're doing, it doesn't require full-time devs, or the business has changed, and businesses do contract. That's a thing that people don't like talking about, but not every business's best days are ahead of it, but it's still doing the job it needs to do. You and I were talking about like the buggy whip industry. There's like that last buggy whip company. Long after the horse-drawn carriages become a thing of the past, there will still be some demand for buggy whips, and it may not be what it used to be, but that could be a sustainable, multi-100-year business potentially, because horses are probably still going to exist 100 years from now, right? So taking over those, and then the first one, when you embed a dev, they're kind of like not just a dev helping maintain, but they're also kind of cross-training the other devs in the Planet Argon way of doing things, right?
Yes.
Which may be an extension of, like, for example, the Ruby on Rails philosophy of like convention over configuration, and a lot of the other kind of ideology around just getting things done, being business-minded and not getting too lost in the sauce as far as like this is the trending technology, or we've got to have XYZ because everybody's got to have XYZ. No, like, let's go back to first principles. What actually delivers value? What actually gets things done? Right? So that engineer will be kind of like in there kind of evangelizing the way that you all get things done, and maybe deprogramming people who spend too much time on Hacker News.
A little bit. Yeah. And like, maybe that's not like the things that you're trying to accomplish, or they'll come in and like, what do you think? And then we can share. Also, one of the other benefits that clients have when they get to work with us is like they get the exposure to, we have all these anecdotes and stories like, whoa, we actually work with this one company, and though they had 70 developers and they were dealing with this, they had been using this certain pattern in their web application, and all these microservices, and their team went from 70 people, 80 people down to 40 people. And then some new issues popped up because they're like, oh, we have too many things to manage. And like, so they regretted some of the decisions that they were making when they were growing, because they assumed that their team would keep growing. So how do we have I think it's good for us to think like, how do we develop software with the mindset that the software is going to scale, and the team's going to keep scaling as the software scales. But what we've learned is that teams need to actually have more conversations around like what happens when there's actually less people responsible for maintaining the software we're working on. And maybe that's the ideal state for this particular project. It's like, yeah, we need 50 people to build this up to here, but the ideal scenario is like in 7 years, there's going to be 20 people taking care of this. So what you need to get there, you might organize your code base based off of what you perceive your org structure might be today or tomorrow. But in 5 years, that org chart might be drastically compressed, and that might be the ideal situation. So then you've got people working on some other projects. So we'll come in and be able to like help people kind of navigate, like be mindful when you're making decisions about like that are being driven by, because most people get hired, as we talked about earlier, into organizations that are already have things in motion, decisions already in motion. You're growing, and if you're hired in the middle of a hiring spree, you might have this perception that the team's going to keep hiring people. But what happens when they stop and they need to have less people maintaining it? And if you're still around with this, like you're going to have to live with all of your coworkers that may not be there as decisions as well. So like you need to kind of rein that in as well. And I think that's an important thing that we can offer that when we're in our consulting engagements. But the other part about like where are we at as an industry in running a consultancy is some of our expertise is a little bit more commoditized, if we're being honest. Like now someone be like, hey, we're dealing with this weird problem as an organization and technically, and people can go to Perplexity or ChatGPT and have a conversation and talk some ideas out. And it gives them some reasonable advice on how to maybe approach it. Whether or not they'll follow through on that is a different question, but it will at least give you some good advice. And it's not like people couldn't find this information out. Like everything we've learned from our peers and from storytelling, from talking with other clients, or, you know, the hallway tracks of conferences over the years. And so none of this is like secrets. It just ends like secrets of the trade or anything, but it's more easily accessible. What we can offer you is a bit of accountability. So like we've had to change our model a little bit to think like, how do we not just give people like, here's a direction we can start going and here's our advice, but like maybe they need a little bit more external accountability, a little bit more check. Right. So how do you turn into coaches in a way? And like, how do you like hold them like, okay, here we are, we're going to help you get through the process. We're not going to do it all for you. Your team needs to learn how to take care of your garden themselves. Like a great gardener would be like someone that can come in and be like, here's what we did today. But if you see these types of things start popping up, you might want to pull those ones out of the garden. And I think that's an important thing that I think any consultants could be offering right now is don't just be someone that can do, because doing is going to be commoditized a little more. And there's always, but we've been hearing that for years. It's like, it's always going to be
right.
Who's going to be the cheapest? We're going to outsource the work to, you know, some other country, and we do a bit of that ourselves now. And so it's just like, but the quality hasn't gone down, and it's just, I don't know. It's an interesting, but yeah, anyways, it's,
so you're very deeply involved in the process if you're outsourcing to another consultancy or something like that, is what you're saying, another agency, or if you have like remote devs that are working with you on just a few specific projects, but they're using your kind of methodology and you're involved, you're in the loop to quality assure.
And to help report progress to stakeholders and explain why things are complicated, to be a second unbiased voice in the conversations. Because sometimes leadership will come in, and especially if someone new gets hired and they're like, what's going on? Why does everything seem why does the development team seem like they're a little log jammed right now? Like things seem to be moving slower than I've seen at other organizations I've worked at. And then we can come in and be like, yeah, here's what we're seeing. And here's things we think can do. Here's what your team could, leadership could do to whether it's budgets, professional development, so I think sometimes those companies, those organizations would like us to tell us tell them, well, you might want to get rid of these 2 people on your team because they're kind of like a problem. For the team, but like we try to stay out of that stuff, but it does come up. We do come in and get hired by like a CEO is like, hey, I need you to, is it my technical leadership? Is that actually part of the problem? And so
let's talk a little bit about that, because that is going to be helpful for anybody who's managing developers who maybe they are a developer, but they're several steps removed. Maybe they came in as a developer and then they got on the management track, and now they've got this team of devs that are maybe even like a layer or two below them in the hierarchy. And how would they identify, problematic devs? Like, what are the telltale signs of this person's actually maybe they're helping? What I often compare things to is you can go to the gym and you can shoot steroids into your arm every day, or into your butt, I think is where they shoot them. I've never taken them. And you can get results, right? And or certainly the illusion results, whether they'll be sustainable. But if you actually want to do it the right way and invest the time and energy, that's like the progress is going to be a lot slower, and it's going to be very hard for a team that's been shooting steroids into their butt every day to have to go to the gym and do it the old-fashioned natural way after they've gotten off the steroids, right? They're not going to have the same perception of progress. I imagine there are lots of those types of things that you've encountered when you're looking at a developer team. And what would be some advice to like identify those kinds of people who are just look like they're going fast because they're shooting steroids, or maybe they're not planning to stick around for a long time, so they're introducing more technical debt and they're actually a net negative secretly. Like, have you identified some patterns that you like to kind of potentially like broach to managers?
It's an interesting thing. I try to reflect on a few engagements that I was directly involved in, and usually, for being honest, like a lot of people usually have a suspicion that they know who that person or those team members are, and so they usually want some validation one way or another, either to support their theory or not. And so they'll kind of send us on a little bit of they might plant some seeds like, hey, can you keep an eye on so-and-so and just let us know, which is kind of a weird thing to come into. And, I don't want people listening to this to be like, well, we should never bring in external consultants because they're just probably being to figure out, it's like the two Bobs thing and the Office Space.
The Office Space? Yeah.
It's just like,
so what exactly
do you do
here?
And so I'm like, that's not why we're coming in there. We're here to help the organization and the team, like improve their day-to-day life. And then if through that process, someone doesn't get to be around anymore, there's probably maybe a reasonable reason for that. I don't know that we've ever been, if anything, I can count on at least one hand a number of people that I've recommended that teams let go of that they just will not let go of. And they don't care. So they don't take our advice, even if we do give them advice. And that's usually been scenarios where someone that's been around for like 15 years keeps everything kind of themselves. They don't play well with other people, and they're not really good at sharing responsibility and ownership of the code base and very protective of their areas. And it's not because there's any malice to it or anything, or because it's like job security. It's actually a weird thing, I think, related to more of their legacy. It comes from a source of embarrassment that I always think that, like, as software developers, we all have projects that we can probably think of. If anyone listening is like, think about a project you're really proud of, but if you had to hand it over to someone else tomorrow to pass the baton, what do you feel guilty about? What do you feel like, oh, I really wish I could have done X, Y, and Z to make this a little bit better for the next person? Because, like, if there's an exercise that I've in one of my newsletters that I start people off with, like, write me a letter and be like, if you have to pass it, like, today's the last day on your project you're ever going to work on, you have to quickly send a quick email, be like, here's what you should know about the code base. You got 20 minutes to draft an email, send it over, and you're walking out the door. Here's what you should know. What are the gotchas? What are the things that, like, what would you put in that email? And then those are, so when I speak to, like, back to the point around, like, the original, that other, like, a developer they're embarrassed about all the things that they didn't get to do. So there's this weird thing where, like, I think what if they were to admit that they didn't get a chance to work on X, Y, and Z, all these, I'm air quoting, best practices for our audio listeners, that this would be a better situation. So, like, I think they have, like, a sense of pride that, like, because the company knows how reliable they've been over those 15 years at the company, and maybe even certain leadership is like, oh, that person's like, that's our guy, that's our developer, she's the one that's, like, she's always been there for us. And so that's, like, their identity. Now you pass on that baton to someone else, and someone else is now living with all of those decisions and all the time that they didn't have to improve the test coverage, add documentation because there wasn't that many people to ever read the documentation. their legacy is now tainted, you
Right.
know, and that's a really tricky situation we've seen so many times, and it's usually like small organizations, and these are
So
organizations
you're
with
talking
like,
about the developer is worried, like people are going to realize I'm not half as good as I actually am, and that I've just been kind of like fudging things because I'm trying to get things done.
not fudging, just skipping, not adding a lot of process where it wasn't needed for 15 years.
Okay.
You know? I think it's just that like they didn't really optimize it for a team, because it was always like just a few people working on it, and that was their area of responsibility. And so what's the advantage of writing really thorough commit messages if no one is ever going to look at it except for you? Well,
Right.
and I would argue that's
so,
actually...
So it's just a priority thing, basically. And yes, I would argue you should still write very clear commit messages,
Yes.
regardless. But it sounds like if you are you've settled in, you're doing a whole lot of development. Like we published a very popular article. It's been read maybe more than 1 million times on the freeCodeCamp publication called "We Fired Our Best Developer, Best Decision We Ever Made," and that's been a very interesting kind of like discussion around like, okay, they lay out this person who's been building all this stuff, but over time they become kind of territorial and protective of like different systems, and the code becomes extremely difficult to maintain. And then the very lengthy process of like unwinding that code base and handing it off to other people after they let this person go. And the person was just, it wasn't that they were necessarily incentivized to go in their own direction, but they just became very protective of their code.
Right.
And they didn't feel like they needed to explain everything. But every company, assuming it's like a solvent company that still has like cash flow and stuff like that, it's going to continue to exist, right? Like companies very rarely just say, okay, we're going out of business. We could keep staying in business, but we're just going to go out of business, right? That is pretty rare. And so you should assume, as long as there's still a market being served, that company is just going to keep going indefinitely, and it's going to potentially exceed the career span of that dev that's been doing so much work inside there. 15 years is a long time.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of developer careers, especially if they're like well-compensated developers, maybe they'll retire when they're like in their 50s or 60s, right? You can't do that in other fields, but you can in software development. And if that's the case, you're looking at a dev who's in their 40s, and you have to be thinking like, wow, this person might be gone in 5 or 10 years. We need to act quickly. What would you say to a manager who has like a few key devs in their organization and they don't necessarily feel ready for a generational handoff?
I think what I would tell them is that there's a few things they could do. You could work. Well, does that person, like if you have one of those, the Territorial or just someone that's been there for quite a while, have they had a lengthy vacation? Do you have sabbaticals, or can you come up with some sort of reason to test out how your team would handle things for an extended period of time without them being around? What would you need to do in it? Like it's succession planning. Like at the end of the day, like any healthy organization, it doesn't matter like this isn't a software development even specific problem, but like my business partner he's planning to retire in the next year or so, and like so we're having to think about succession planning, and it's like it's not developer stuff, it's necessarily, but it's like it is. But that's part of the responsibility of running a well-organized any organization, is to think about succession. Like what happens when this person steps down or needs to step away? What will we do in that? Can you plan for it? And it'd be the healthy answer is to put a plan in place and to think, what does succession planning look like for a specific role? And you can think about that and then apply it to a software code base lens. But like, let's say, does FreeCodeCamp have a succession plan if Quincy needs to step aside for personal reasons, help, maybe not. And I think,
yeah, we do. In case I die, that's the only reason that, like, unless I was mentally incapacitated, I have no intention of like leaving FreeCodeCamp. Just to be clear, and
sure.
FreeCodeCamp's a charity. I don't have enough money to retire even if I want to.
Right, but I do think there's that, like, that's healthy. And like, I was on a board of directors for a nonprofit, and that was like constantly a conversation we would have as a board, being like, when are we going to get to succession planning? We're like, well, let's just hope that our executive director never leaves. And we're like, but we need to plan for it. At least give us a framework for how we would start approaching that. Our best guesses on how we would approach it. And so, and just know that you're not going to get it all right, and that's going to be okay. But I think at the end of the day, you can find people who can help you get through those situations. And sometimes that's bringing in external support, finding some other specialists, people that know how to work on existing code bases. Like that is so I guess from maybe in a selfish way, I do feel like, as you said, the buggy thing, there's going to be a need for people who can like dive into a messy situation and be like, all right, what's going on? How do you deploy these apps? Let's just get down to the basics and we'll figure this out. Because a lot of the projects we've worked on and inherited over the years have usually been because someone maybe got fired or other agency, consultancy was fired, and we had to just get thrown in. We didn't get to talk to the previous developers. Yeah, we still get to work on those projects for the next 5 to 10 years. So there are people out there that have the skill sets for doing that, and any developer could do that. I did. There was once a point when I didn't have the skill, and now I do. So I think it's just I'll figure it out as a healthy mindset for anyone coming into this industry. Just like, we'll figure it out. And now there's a lot of tooling out there to help us maybe figure that out a little bit quicker.
Yeah. And just on the tooling, I know that you've experimented with some of the LLM code generation tools and things like that, and you've explored it. What is some tooling that you're actually excited about that you think is actually like living up to the hype? We're surrounded by hype, of course. CEOs of hardware companies saying like, oh, you don't need to teach your kids to code anymore. Things like that. That's the kind of stream that we're swimming upstream against. That's the flow we're swimming up against. Just like lots of prominent people basically saying like, learning to code is dead and stuff like that. It's like a huge part of my day-to-day conversation with people is reassuring, no, it's not that simple. But like, what are some tools that you think are like that you actually use that you think are improving utility that you think might be worth adopting for some businesses out there, some developer teams that do actually like live up to the proverbial hype, with the presumption that everything's probably overhyped?
Things are definitely overhyped. A few things that I mean, there's like the open source tools that I'm always kind of excited about, but they're not necessarily AI focused. But I do pay for, tools like ChatGPT. I do pay for Claude Code. I'm on like whatever the $200 a month plan is right now. And for me and for my organization, like that's not a huge cost concern necessarily. I'm like, I was a little sensitive to it at first. I'm like, that's whatever. It's pretty expensive, but for the amount of like what I've been able to do with it, I'm like, oh, it's paying for itself and at least giving me the illusion that it's paying for itself. So I do think but I've not been spending a lot of time tinkering with lots of different varieties of AI tooling. I've always been a little bit more on the, like, I'm a little on the skeptical. Well, I'm going to let some other people, I'm not an early adopter on this particular technology. I'm going to let other people kind of experiment a little bit. And maybe that's a little bit of coming out of like I feel like I was very cynical of the Web3 era, or, I don't feel like I'm hearing people talk about, what is, oh my gosh, like
building on smart contracts and things like that.
So, yeah, exactly. And I'm like, what happened to that? And like, I thought that was like the whole thing that we were all trying to move towards. So, but it's hard to argue that you can't give Claude Code a reasonable prompt and watch it generate some code for you and be like, not bad. It's better than it looked 6 months ago. Not still quite up to so I think it still requires you to come up with like figuring out how you're going to instruct it and like what your parameters are and how it's going to, even though you might work on your agents markdown files and all your rules about like when you're working in Ruby, here's the principles that our team here's our style guide. We have to write, we were always working on our tests. We're trying to be TDD based things and like always make sure you run your linters before you run your tests, because your test might pass and then you might run your linter and the linters will break your test. And then there's all of like little workflow. These are still all the things we were still doing. You're just trying to tell an agent how to do it a little bit quicker for you. So I think with anything, we're starting to use it on some client projects here and there. And clients are kind of now, I think maybe one thing about consulting is like 6 months ago, clients were nervous about it because they were worried about security, data concerns. But they're like, okay, well, now that we've been able to show them this is a bit more like we're being assisted. We're not just letting agents' codes run rampant on their code base. We're like, there's a human guiding this thing, and the human is responsible for the work that gets done and committed to the project. Robbie, am responsible and I'm going to have to explain myself if why this thing was so buggy, that's on me. And that's like, that doesn't change. Right. And so
Yeah.
I think if teams, so I think if, the thing that we have heard though, is there's also clients that are curious about like, well, maybe we don't need teams like Planet Argon. Maybe I could just do this myself, but I don't have any Ruby. And maybe we don't need developers, and because they're seeing the hype of the last year, and we have clients that are not software engineers that will take the repository and they'll try to get it up running using Claude or something like a Claude or something. And where they're like, oh, we're going to try like building some new landing pages and build like a new form or something. And then it's crickets. We don't hear from them again about that. And then like, it's just back to normal with us. And so they're like, okay, yeah. They're like, all right, that didn't quite work yet for them, but they can probably spin up a new website with something lovable and build, like that. You can do stuff like that. And I think that's great. Maybe we don't need to worry about those types of projects anymore. So when anything gets more complicated, it's not quite there yet, but so to answer your question, I don't think I'm saying anything different than anyone else would say. It's like, yeah, Cloud Code is like showing some value. I also use Copilot because GitHub is nice enough to give me a free license because of OhMyZSH, and they want me to use it, and I have, which has led to some repercussions in the community. That's a whole topic, but I think there's more of a tension in the broader community of like whether or not it's ethical or not to that, and that's a whole different topic that I'm not super excited to get into, but
we could get into that, but like I'll kind of summarize my sentiments if that's helpful. Code, please. Like open source code, being trained on open source code that is explicitly put out there in the open source. Of course, we didn't know when we were writing code 15 years ago that it was going to be used to train LLMs, but because it's out in the open and it's like open source, like BSD licensed, MIT licensed, I mean, like personally, I don't look at LLM code generation the same way as I would look at like AI, air quotes, art and stuff like that. Like, because there was a degree of consent when you're making your project open source now. How much of that? But I don't think it's as explosive of a topic as the AI topic. So I personally don't take qualms with it. Like, if somebody submits a PR and it's clear that like some of it was written, but you actually have a great take on this, and I read this article. Basically, it all comes down to like, okay, can you explain and defend all the different changes that this PR is making? It doesn't really matter whether they were your changes or the LLM's changes, as long as you understand why. And LLMs are very bad about like staying on track and not accidentally touching a whole lot of other stuff that didn't need to be touched, and they'll leave this huge, footprint across the entire code base if you just let them go in unchecked. But with like the tab completion, which I think is really useful for developers, you are still looking at the code and you're looking at it in real time as you're writing the code and like running it and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of like an unambiguous, like good. And it's not completely unambiguous because people will atrophy in like their actual syntax and their ability to actually write code. But I don't think it's as big of a problem as I think a lot of people may think it is. I don't know what your thoughts are.
No, I think the article you're referencing is like, it was like maybe the keeping humans, you need to keep humans in the loop in the process.
Yeah.
But like when we OhMyZSH, for the project that I am one of the maintainers of, and we needed to put together some sort of AI contribution policy, and we looked at a lot of different projects to see how different projects were handling it. And one of the things that the natural thing was like, oh, we're going to create like a new policy around AI usage in general, because like a lot of other pretty notable projects had done that, and they have like whole large swaths of content talking about AI when it's appropriate or not to use it. And then, but I was like, I just feel like if the more we keep treating it as like this own thing, the more confusing it is for us to really kind of grapple with what it really is just another tool in our tool belt. And I think we need to like, just because like the hype is like, it's this whole big thing, I think we just need to no, actually this is just another tool in my tool belt, and I'm not going to make it seem like this. Like the contribution to OhMyZSH or to our open source project is the same as it was. I mean, what I'm trying to say is we decided not to have a huge foundation, like big thing roll out of like, here's what we think about AI. It's more like, let's be real. Like, you're probably using AI. We don't even know if you are or not, but we'd like you to disclose it if you are. We don't need to know your prompt. because I don't know that we can tell the difference between like, did you have it right, a whole like file versus code, or did it just autocomplete? Because, and like, what is AI anymore when you're using VS Code? I'm like, I don't know where that line is. I don't know how you turn that off, like no AI help. What does that look like if it's just like an autocomplete? Like the example you gave.
Yeah, and part of this is just the term AI is so vague.
It is.
But like having an LLM generate code based on what's in the context window, which is often the file you're looking at, or maybe the entire code base is there. That is like LLM, like AI assisted code gen, essentially.
So,
yeah.
But the idea was like, we still want you to explain. If we want to have a conversation with you, please don't submit large sweeping changes to the code base, because those are always going to be the slowest for us to react to and respond and get merged anyhow. Even if you wrote it all, if you make huge SWAT, like we're refactoring all of OhMyZSH to make it faster, and it was just like you touch 50 files, like who are you? And like what are we doing? It's like let's
that would never have been okay even before LLM tools.
So now
things should be like small.
Yeah,
small,
it should be
reasonable, well-scoped changes.
We're a bunch of volunteers. We have limited time, and the 5-line change that we can quickly review and approve, just like it is at work in your day job. If for those that have a job working in software development, or thinking to this and the students that will one day have those jobs as well, like those changes are way easier to approve, and so keep them small as you possible. So I think because there's just too much context, right? And so to wrap your head around. So that was our approach with like introducing some AI guidelines. Like, let's make it a subsection of our general contribution thing and not treat it like this big thing. But it also gives the point we wanted to make was it gives our maintainers the freedom to be like, this particular PR that was submitted by someone we've never interacted with before, this smells, our gut feels like this is AI generated. We ask them a question and they don't seem like they can respond and explain themselves. We're just going to go ahead and close this and say, we're not doing this because humans didn't really spend that much time working on this. And at the end of the day, we're trying to make a tool that's more delightful for humans interacting with the terminals. So we're not saying no AI contributions, because we can't really hold anyone accountable to that. But we're also saying we reserve the right to be like, let's just keep this for us humans as much as possible.
Yeah. And one of the more profound observations that I've read in your work is that the bottleneck is not code generation, creating new code, opening new PRs. It's reviewing those PRs and being able to understand, okay, is this like, it's essentially like code review is the real bottleneck. And a lot of what I guess developing software in 2026 for a lot of people is who are depending a lot on these tools to actually generate the code is going to be reading the code, reviewing it, making sure that it all makes sense. But for your team, especially running this very popular open source project that millions of people use, a lot of that is just being gatekeepers to quality and making sure that weird cruft doesn't creep in into your code base. And I mean, you run the maintainability podcast, right? Yeah. It's a huge part of what you do is maintain software. And that's probably a lot of things you think about. So I would point everybody to this kind of like AI policies. This is like very like thoughtful. And it's clear that you put a great deal of thought into what is practical, not just what is pie in the sky ideal, but like what will actually work sustainably over a long period of time. Because I think a lot of people are kind of like knee jerk, maybe like putting their finger up in the air to see where the wind's blowing. Like, okay, how hard do we need to be on like AI code contributions to like posture ourselves as being, developer first or whatever the sentiment may be. But what you're thinking is, I don't want to have to revise this 6 months down the line, a year down the line, when it becomes completely inviable to tell what was generated by an AI, what was generated by a human, or when everybody's using these tools and it becomes completely arcane that we would, not allow them, things like that. So you're trying to come up with a durable policy, right? Yeah. And also that'll stand.
And give myself and ourselves the flexibility to use the tools when we feel like it's useful without having to, like if the tooling makes more sense for ourselves, like why wouldn't we not use it if it's making sense and be like, well, we're reverting our whole policy. It's like, let's just be real with ourselves. And like, and also I'm like, if I want to use maybe AI to help me improve a little bit of documentation to make a couple paragraphs a little cleaner. Like, I don't want to feel like I'm tempered by what I can and can't do for myself either.
You don't want to necessarily feel dirty about it. Like, am I deceiving people in what I'm doing? I think just focusing on the output rather than the process to arrive at that output is a good place to be.
Maybe disclose it, and that's like and be okay with that. I think the more we disclose it, then it's easier for us to kind of assess the situation.
Yeah. So I want to move kind of to our last question here because you've been very generous with your time. I know you're busy running an agency and also maintaining this popular open source project that I use and pretty much everybody on the freeCodeCamp team uses it, I think. So let's talk about command line tools because you run a popular command line tool that essentially makes the command line much more customizable, OhMyZSH, and it also makes it much more like people can really own it. I love the templating system and everything like that. And a lot of times I'll be in my terminal and people are like, oh, how did you get your terminal to look like that? And I'm like, oh, check out OhMyZSH, right? But there are other terminal-based tools, and there's an entire kind of like ecosystem of tooling for the terminal that is cropping up. Can you talk about some other open source terminal-focused projects that you're excited about?
Yeah, a couple of things. It's just kind of getting down to the bare principles, I guess, or the basics. So I think I want to explain there's like the CLI tools and there's like the TUI, the TUIs, the terminal user interfaces. And like a TUI would be an example, like if you've installed Claude Code or something like that in your, if you installed it and you run Claude in your terminal and it pulls up a little interface that you can interact with, like that's a TUI. And we've had TUIs for as long as we've had computers with terminal computers. Before we had desktops where you can have a scroll with your mouse and everything, we would have a text interface. And so OhMyZSH is a command line interface, and those are two. So I think the things I find it really interesting right now that I'm super excited about, things like Ghosty, which is a newer terminal. It's an open source terminal. I'm wearing a Ghosty t-shirt now, and that's an open source project, and that's cross-platform. And it's also taking advantage of some newer capabilities of computers that didn't exist when, let's say, the last round of terminals were created. Like, if you're working on a Mac, it comes with a terminal, and that's great. But for years, have been using another one called iTerminal or iTerm and iTerm 2, and I still use it quite a bit, but I've been using Ghosty because I got early access to it. And it's a different, like, little bit of configuration, but there's some new features and technology in there that's kind of exciting. And it's an open source project you can kind of watch. I don't fully understand I'm not that low level enough of a programmer to fully understand the code, but it's kind of been fun to watch it evolve and be part of that community. So I'm excited about that. And then you can do some cool things like use that terminal to embed the technology and other pieces of software. So I think we're going to see a lot more Ghosty, I think, in the next few years, as like Ghosty is also just a library that you can use and to embed inside of other software projects. So I think that's changing. And I think at the end of the day, I think what I did not anticipate with like AI tooling was just like how quickly everybody was basically, even ChatGPT is a command line interface in the sense that you're communicating, like you're texting with the tool or whatever, you're having a conversation and you get quick feedback. It's like and you're not pointing and clicking around to get the answers. You're interacting with with the computer terminal, so to speak. And OhMyZSH is a tool within that space. And so it's always been, how do we optimize that experience? And so it's kind of been really exciting to see people get really excited and more comfortable in the terminal. And OhMyZSH, I think, was always a really good gateway into that and be like, look, it's a little less intimidating. It's a little bit cozier. And now people are taking some of that ethos and they're making really nice terminal user interfaces, better tooling. You're seeing a lot of cool little animations and colors and just the vibe in the terminal. Like if you use Bun to install things, or it's just a little bit richer. People are spending a little bit more time working on those animations because our computers are way faster, because a lot of that technology like Zsha was invented 25 years ago when we didn't have the computers and CPU processing that we have now. So I think that's exciting. And other tools and there's also another open source project is Omachi, which is a Linux thing, which was also created by the creator of Ruby on Rails, DHH. But and it's not the technology necessarily so much itself. It's just been how quickly to see a community of people just be like, we're going to get a brand new computer. We're going to install Linux on it. And I'm going to live in the terminal and desktop now and just get rid of some of the cruft of my typical desktop environment and try to optimize my workflow. So I think there is a little bit of a resurgence of people wanting to get more, what's the word I'm looking for? They want to level up. I think there's like, everybody feel like I know enough CLI shortcuts to get myself and to get by on things, but like, oh, can I actually become a power user of some of these tools? That's exciting. And I think I love seeing that kind of that spirit happen. And then I'm only using like Linux for maybe like 15% of my week right now, but like I have another computer that I have that on so I can switch back and forth between them and stuff like that. So I'm going into coding mode, but I still lean on my Mac for quite a bit of my work as well.
Yeah.
But I'm also not coding as much as like a typical software developer because I'm running a business and I spend a lot more time in email on Zoom calls.
Yeah.
So
yeah, one of the unfortunate, symptoms of success that you have to spend a lot more time actually emailing and interacting with clients than you do working on stuff a lot of times.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ghosty, cross-platform, so it's available on Linux and Mac and Windows. And then you mentioned Machi.
Oh, Machi, yeah.
Yeah, and you want to shout out Fuzzy, what is it called? FZF?
FZF is a fuzzy finder. It's a really cool tool for in CLI for doing kind of fuzzy matching and include a link and people can go play with that and stuff like that. But there's a really good plugin for that for OhMyZSH as well. It's for FZF.
Okay, awesome. And then Omarchi?
Yeah.
Omachi. Okay, that's the one that you were talking about.
It does have an R in it, but it's like a silent R. I think it's like a reference to like Japanese. I forget the reference there, but yeah. It's kind of like curation is like, I think the idea. It's like someone's curated approach to a Linux environment.
Okay, so very opinionated. Perfect for coming from DHH, a very opinionated developer. Awesome. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Just to recap what we talked about, like your approach toward maintaining an open source project in the new era of AI powered contributions, pull requests and things like that. We talked about a lot of the philosophy around, companies wanting to be able to have that tension of let's move quickly, but let's also move safely, and how over the years they've accumulated all these safeguards that may feel like they're slowing things down, but they're actually well-intentioned. It's just that like you have to strike that balance, right? And then we also talked a lot about just like how you operate as a agency in terms of like helping either embed a dev there or just taking over the engineering role of like the entire engineering department for a given company. And we talked about the fact that like businesses do contract sometimes, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to necessarily have like a full engineering team if your business is contracting, but you can otherwise continue to sustain the business because developers cost a lot of money. Their time is worth a lot. So
you got to keep them busy.
Yeah. So I've learned a tremendous amount from this. I hope everybody enjoys checking out your excellent blog, Robbie on Rails, which is very insightful. Like one thing that I'll say that you and I didn't really get a chance to talk about, but we are both huge advocates of having your own place on the web and not fully handing things over to your Facebook page, like my company's Facebook page, or relying on like just some given platform for everything. Like if you actually own and control your own destiny through owning a domain, I think that's a profoundly positive thing. And
indeed, I agree with that.
Yeah, and you've been doing that for 20 plus years on Robbie on Rails. Yeah.
Well, thanks for having me, Quincy.
Yeah, it's been a blast. Everybody, until next week, happy coding.
Happy coding.